Guarani people in South America watched with great interest as strangers moved along the ancient trade routes. These were not merchants from other tribes. Some of the men wore very bizarre clothing, like the scales of armadillos. Very large and oddly shaped deer, some strong enough to carry one of these strangers, traveled through their country, never paying respects to the leaders of the clans as they went along. The strangers didn't seem to know where they were going. At creeks and other features, they rooted around like they were looking for something they'd lost. Their language was unintelligible, sounding like gibberish to the Guarani. Witnesses to these intruders must have wondered what effects these strangers might have on their lives, what part, if any, they might play in the future of the Guarani. One group, traveling through the land of the Guarani, was led by Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, bound for a future as unknown as his remarkable past. Native Americans watched as he approached and then found one of their most sacred sites, Iguazu Falls. So much of the Guarani world was sacred. This land that they shared with countless living things was generous to those who respected and loved it. The Guarani people were composed of numerous villages in the region, far-flung communities connected through language and culture. This was not the part of South America that yielded riches from gold and silver mines. Yet Europeans began moving in, convinced that precious metals were there for the taking. The Guarani watched as more strangers came. It wasn't long before parties would capture some of their people and cast them into slavery. Whether the strangers spoke Spanish or Portuguese, it made no difference. Capturing slaves and searching for gold was something they all did. The Guarani shared South America with many other Native American groups. Those on much of the West Coast developed a highly sophisticated empire, the Inca Empire. While this far-flung empire was highly hierarchical, citizens enjoyed security and participation at many levels. The empire organized local gatherings called mitas, at which public work projects were carried out by communities. The Inca had a well-developed road system, including bridges spanning streams and other impediments. The roads had a use for business of the empire, but they also served the very communities that constructed and maintained them. When not working on the projects of public works, Inca citizens were free to earn a living for themselves and their families. Surplus food was stored throughout the empire for times of crop failures. Great cities rose under the power of the Inca rulers. The Inca people were masters of adaptation, living well in some of Earth's harshest conditions. From the Altiplano to the Quebrada country in northwest Argentina, people in parts of the Inca Empire found strength in their spiritual beliefs and their traditions, as well as their connection to the land. Disease and political strife foreshadowed the collapse of the empire, brought about by actions by Francisco Pizarro. Pizarro had read the requerimiento to the Inca ruler, explaining that he was now the subject of the king and that the Pope had given this part of the world to Spain.
A ellos se les hizo de mal esto.
Atahualpa told Pizarro, "Your emperor must be a great prince. I don't doubt it. But this Pope must be mad to think he can give away country he's never seen." Atahualpa also declined to convert to Christianity, explaining that his religion suited him just fine. Many things passed before the Inca Empire was destroyed by Pizarro, and the systems that had worked so well for the Inca were bent to serve the interest of Pizarro and other Spaniards near the west coast. By then, the east coast had suffered from contact by Europeans. South America was still attracting explorers and settlers hoping to become wealthy. The Spaniards and Portuguese kept moving inland. The Guarani were never part of the Inca Empire, living well east of its reach. Nonetheless, they would likely have heard about the fall of the Inca, as well as the strange people in giant canoes sailing up the river and causing havoc along the east coast. The Guarani must have followed the movements of Cabeza de Vaca carefully as he trekked to Asuncion. Cabeza de Vaca was appointed governor of the Rio de Plata region, so he relieved the former governor of his office and became the one in charge. He was charged with establishing an overland route to the rich mines of Gran Peru. He was also to encourage settlement in the fledgling settlement of Buenos Aires. Cabeza de Vaca found that there was widespread abuse of Native Americans going on. The Guarani were being hunted down and taken as slaves. As governor, Cabeza de Vaca put an end to this illegal activity. As the highest-ranking Spanish official in the Rio de Plata region, maybe Governor Cabeza de Vaca could protect the Guarani from the abusive practices so common in South America. More hope of change came in 1546 with the arrival in Peru of Blasco Núñez Vela to take charge as viceroy, the king's representative in the region. Vela was armed with determination to enforce the king's new laws, written with urging from Bartolomé de las Casas and perhaps influenced by the writings of Cabeza de Vaca. The new viceroy wasted no time in enforcing the laws to end slavery of Native Americans. Encomenderos thought otherwise. Led by the brother of conquistador Francisco Pizarro, the large landowners killed the viceroy. 1 year earlier, Cabeza de Vaca returned from a trailblazing venture to Asuncion. The former governor had him arrested for poor administration, and he was sent back to Spain to face charges. He would never again step foot in America, but at least he wasn't killed. With the forced absence of Cabeza de Vaca, the taking of slaves and other abuses resumed. In little time, Asuncion grew with more Spanish settlers and with attempts to Christianize the Guarani. This region was home to about 400,000 Guarani speakers, and they already lived a rich spiritual life. To the Guarani, their whole world is alive and filled with sacred places. Iguazu Falls is considered sacred to them. It was that way long before Cabeza de Vaca was the first European to see this giant falls. Some relief came for the Guarani in 1585, 40 years after the arrest of Cabeza de Vaca, when the first Jesuit fathers arrived. King Carlos III authorized them to work with Native Americans. By 1610, the first mission was constructed. The Guarani in the region realized soon that the Jesuits aimed to protect them from the slaving expeditions. The slavers had terrorized many Guarani communities. Enslavement of Native Americans had become an industry in this part of South America. In 1629, an army of slavers attacked several missions, carrying off tens of thousands for sale as slaves and killing any who resisted. More raids followed, closing many of the missions. In 1638, King Carlos IV authorized arming the Mission Guarani with firearms. When 800 slavers attacked the next time, they were repelled by a well-trained army of Native Americans under the leadership of Jesuit priests. The missions were left alone by slavers for 10 years. When slavers returned the following decade, they were met with 7,000 well-armed and highly effective Guarani defenders, turning back the slaving army's 1,500 armed men. The slavers then left the missions alone, but European diseases did not. Smallpox raced through the missions, and 30,000 Guarani died of the disease. That didn't deter Guarani from helping to reestablish missions throughout the region. Missions were spread throughout the areas contested between Spanish and Portuguese colonists. Armed conflict between the European powers was common. Jesuit priests moved some of the missions to be under the protection of Spanish settlements. This brought over 100 years of safety and stability for the Guarani and the Jesuit missionaries. The missions were built and maintained by the labor of Guarani. The Jesuit fathers were tasked with converting the Guarani to Christianity and instructing them in the European culture. Jesuits had a strong element of academic leadership. Along with the university they established in Asunción, they worked with their Guarani clients to develop their academic and vocational talents. The Jesuit missions were called reductions. Colonial authorities supported them because they concentrated the Native Americans into areas in which they had no interest, reducing conflict between settlers and Indians. The missions benefited by the labor of the Guarani and the effective organization of the Jesuit fathers. Most missions were productive, raising and processing crops for sustaining the mission and for sale of surplus. One example is yerba mate, a type of tea that's still widely consumed in South America today. This was all produced by the labor of Native Americans, but working for the missions was considered far better than working for the encomenderos. In Mexico, the conquest of the Aztec Empire was followed by a flood of Spaniards into the area. Conversion of Native Americans to Christianity was pursued with much vigor. Churches soon sprang up throughout the region. Many times the Catholic Church was built atop a temple of an indigenous religion, a clear sign that the old religion was replaced by the new. This church at Cholula appears to be atop a hill, yet it's really built atop a massive pyramid. The Cathedral Our Lady of Guadalupe faces Mexico City's central plaza, called the Zócalo. This section of Mexico City is built atop the central district of Tenochtitlan. The Templo Mayor, the Temple of Quetzalcoatl, and other prominent Aztec structures. While some missionaries attacked the religions of the people in Mexico, others attempted conversion by modeling kindness. In various pueblos, missionaries blended skills possessed by the indigenous people with European artistry and taught some new skills. Thus, one pueblo, like Pátzcuaro, became a center for weaving, while other pueblos had artisans working with silver. The silver mines at Guanajuato still produced massive amounts of precious metals to be sent to Spain in treasure fleets. More mines produce gold and silver in Zacatecas, San Luis de Potosí, and Chihuahua. In Mexico, as well as in Potosí in South America, mines continue producing wealth, although no longer using slave labor. the work is still exhausting and dangerous. So much silver was produced at Potosi, a mint was built to produce silver coins. Enough coins were produced here that the holds of treasure ships were weighed down with boxes of pieces of 8. Treasure fleets with giant galleons gathered gold, silver, and gemstones, along with Asian riches like silk from Manila, and sailed in unison toward Europe. Not all arrived. Some were sunk by violent hurricanes, while others were attacked by pirates. What did arrive pumped massive wealth into Seville, the destination of the treasure fleets. The Guadalquivir River was choked with vessels from America.
Behind me, you would have seen sailing ships because this was a major port in the country of Spain.
The Guadalquivir River eventually silted up as the Spanish Empire began to decline. But during this time, Spain had a powerful incentive to exploit the indigenous people of America. And they did. The earliest evidence of human habitation in America is found in Chile. Monteverde contains evidence of human presence 16,000 years ago. In Santa Cruz, in Argentina, ancient Americans left their strikingly human marks in Cueva Manos. Descendants of these ancient Americans sometimes struggled for power, as when the Mapuche warriors stopped the southern advance of the Inca Empire. Now the invaders were the Spaniards. Resistance was organized by El Joven Lautaro. He had once been a servant to Conquistador Pedro de Valdivia. Although he was defeated, the Mapuche people still live in this area of South America. This was a very active and violent time in America by the Spaniards. The Portuguese were probing deeper into the vast Amazon basin, adding to their colonization and trade monopoly. European control spread throughout South America. Neither the Spanish nor the Portuguese abided by the Treaty of Tordesillas, frequently fighting each other for territory instead. Not until the 1750 Treaty of Madrid did the claim stabilize. That agreement would end over 100 years of stability for Guarani people working with the Jesuit fathers at missions that dotted the Rio Plata area. Part of the agreement stipulated that Guarani missions in Spanish-controlled territory were to be vacated, and the population moved to areas controlled by Portugal. Since the Portuguese were heavily involved in the trade of slaves, this move would have been devastating for Christianized Guarani. The Jesuit missionaries tried to move the people, but they refused. The same native militias that fended off slavers now went to battle with European soldiers. It must have seemed odd that Spanish and Portuguese soldiers that fought against each other now united in fighting the Guarani. The battle was a disaster for them. No longer under protection of Spanish control and badly defeated by united forces, the future looked dim for the Guarani. October 12th is celebrated in much of Europe and America as Columbus Day, but in some places that's starting to change. From the early presence of Spaniards in America, children were born with a mixture of Native American and European blood. In South America, this mixing of races was once encouraged by church officials. The son born to Hernán Cortés and La Meliche was celebrated as the first mestizo, but the races were blended long before then. Mexico celebrates Dia de la Raza in October, marking the new race that was born from this mixing. The result is the emergence of the beautiful children and the warm, hard-working people that make up 85% of the Mexican population. While the cultural orientation of the mestizo is strongly European, they incorporate much from their Native American roots to form a unique and beautiful culture. From a European perspective, America was truly the New World. Consider that for Native Americans, the existence of Europe was a world new to them, though mostly experienced indirectly. The arrival of Spaniards brought animals never before seen to America. Escaped pigs from the De Soto expedition and others became feral, spreading diseases to wildlife and destroying crops in the North American Southeast. Some foods that had been developed over millennia by Native Americans made their way to Europe and later to Africa, Asia, and other parts of the world. These included tomatoes, potatoes, and corn. The flow of these new things between continents is known as the Columbian Exchange. The most devastating exchange was that of diseases for which Native Americans had no immunity. Smallpox, measles, and other European diseases were unquestionably a curse. However, not everything from Europe was a curse. Iron and steel tools and weapons made life easier. Glass beads added color to native weaving. Animals like goats and sheep were embraced by the Navajo in the American Southwest, adding herding to the economy of these adaptable people. By far, the greatest gift of the Spaniards was the horse. Indians in the American Southwest were keen to see the value in these noble animals. Some escaped from Spanish explorers, while others were gained by raids on Spanish settlements. Highly prized by buffalo hunters on the Great Plains, horses transformed the lives of nomadic hunters and made raiding much more successful. There had always been nomadic Native Americans on the Great Plains, and even with no horses, they hunted buffalo. Because of the horse, many tribes moved onto the Great Plains and changed from farming to nomadic hunting. The horse also power-charged the activity of raiding. For some native people, the horse meant freedom. For others, a danger. The Jesuits were not the first missionaries in America. Their order was not established until after colonization of America was underway. While Dominicans and Franciscans were the first orders to take on Christianization of Native Americans, Jesuit missions served the purpose of instructing Indians in European culture and expanding areas of Spanish influence. The Jesuits established missions in Florida and Baja California, as well as their widespread system in South America. In 1767, Jesuits were expelled from America by Spanish decree. Guarani leaders pleaded to have the Jesuits stay, but to no avail. The missions were turned over to other religious orders, mostly Franciscans, but the missions rapidly declined. One legacy of the Jesuits was the education they provided to Guarani. Many were able to establish themselves in various professions. South America continued to develop as possessions of Spain and Portugal. Native Americans continued to be stripped of their territory and traditional way of life as European influence grew in El Sur. Some Guarani survived these changes, but would any of their culture survive?